Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
We've had some difficulty with the transcription. Everybody in this room will have live transcription. It may be that you, sir, do not have live transcription, but a full transcript will be available at the end of the day if you don't have it.
Don't worry about me. I prefer to read it afterwards anyway, Mr. Blake.
Thank you. Mr. Ferlinc, we left off on the audit process manual, and it's POL 000848801, Chapter 3, Performing a Branch Audit. Can we go to page 11 of that? Thank you. And if we could scroll down to 8.2, there's a section in this manual that addresses Horizon reports. Does this set out what reports an auditor would have available to them when they conducted an audit?
Can you just confirm which section you're looking at?
Yes, absolutely. So if we have a look, for example, at 8.2.4,
Okay.
it says there the following report printouts must be obtained from the Horizon system, examined and filed with the working papers in line with the current retention process.
Okay. On my screen, it goes down to 3 bullet points. Is that all there is?
No, it scrolls over the page.
Okay.
I mean, perhaps you can talk us through, using this document or just your own recollection, the kinds of reports that an auditor would be able to have access to.
I mean, I would say essentially everything that the manager in charge of that branch would have access to. So we're talking about reports that identify which stock units are at the branch in use. We're talking about transfers between those stocks, remittances in and out of the branch, an office snapshot or a balance snapshot which will highlight at any moment in time what should be in the branch and how the balance position should look like. So I think that virtually all the reports that the auditors would have access to would be accessible to the person in charge of the branch.
And am I right in saying they would either have the sub-postmaster log in themselves or they would have their own login to access those reports on the branch's own system?
Correct.
We're going to hear in this phase about issues with what we know as Fujitsu ARQ data. That is Fujitsu held transaction data from Fujitsu's raw audit trail. Was ARQ data provided to post office branch auditors?
Not to auditors. That would have been obtained by the investigators.
Was any other Fujitsu audit data held by Fujitsu, such as product of the raw audit trail or later the audit table, provided to auditors?
I'm not aware of that. My recollection is the only information that the auditors accessed at the branch were on the Horizon system at the branch that a manager level access could also obtain.
Thank you very much. Was consideration given, or are you aware of any discussions relating to the obtaining of that kind of audit data from Fujitsu for auditors, for example, in the case of a serious dispute about a transaction with a sub-postmaster?
Yeah, and this goes back to the investigation team having access to that data. I think there came a point, and I'm not quite sure who made the decision or when the decision was made, that raw data would be made available to investigators rather than auditors. So having that fine line between who's using that data. So even though in Fujitsu's terms it might be available to a PO internal auditor, we would define it as investigators would use that data for investigation purposes rather than auditors. And as I said to you in response to a question earlier today, I think with hindsight, there may have been some guidance, training that could have been provided to auditors to access that data, use the data, particularly when the discrepancy perhaps wasn't serious enough to involve an investigator, but may have been a discrepancy that worried the branch.
So we talked earlier about, for example, the auditor checking whether X equaled Y. Is it fair to say that they didn't have sufficient information to identify why X didn't equal Y?
Yeah, if X didn't equal Y, it wasn't clear what the difference would be. So there could be a number of reasons, and it was often difficult to establish what that reason could be.
And was it because nobody thought of transferring that kind of information to branch auditors, or were there in fact difficulties in obtaining that information, for example, from Fujitsu?
I'm not sure at the outset whether it was envisaged that auditors would have that access to the data, and whether it would be too complex for them to analyse. And as I say, that may be when the decision was made to push that avenue towards the investigators to perform that role.
And were you aware of any difficulties in investigators obtaining that information?
Only in terms of, I believe they had a level to which they could make requests. They could only have so many requests in a particular period, I believe.
Thank you. And we'll come on to look at some documents in that regard. I'm going to move on now to the security policy. And can we look at poll 303867, please? Now, we spoke before lunch about the difference between a process document and a policy document. Is this what you had in mind when you referred to a policy document?
Yes.
And can you just outline for us, using this as an example, what the difference is between a process and a policy?
I guess the policy would probably be more for a wider audience than where the process manual was simply for auditors to work to. The policy manual would have a wider remit.
Who would you have in mind for this particular policy?
I mean, it probably says in terms of the audience there, but basically that group of people, people in the retail line and the network, including agents, transaction processing, product and brand accounting as it became known.
So quite a wide distribution.
Yeah.
This one is written by yourself. You're listed there as the author. Was that a significant document for you as far as you were concerned?
I think from my recollection, and it does say version control replaces previous versions, I think there were different varieties of this policy, of a losses policy, that was born in the late 1990s. And I think this probably, trying to look at the timeline here.
If we scroll down, it may assist actually, because there's some slight confusion in the document, because if we scroll down to the bottom, but keeping that table that we can currently see at the bottom, slightly below that, it actually refers to it being version 2.0, January 2004, albeit we saw at the top it said version control 1.7, September 2003. I don't know if that assists or doesn't assist.
Just an admin error, I guess. But yeah, I think this is just the latest version of similar policies that were badged under different areas. And it goes back to the fact that in this period, 2003, the audit team reported to Tony Marsh's security team. So I think he probably took policies that were drawn by me and had them under his ownership.
So would the words that are used in this policy be your words?
I would expect them to be my words.
And
With input. I mean, as you can see from the top there's quite a few people who would have input to the policy.
And at this stage, you were audit and inspections manager, and that was, as you've explained, part of the security team.
Yep.
Version 1.2 there refers to amendments following discussions with the NFSP and the policy being agreed with the NFSP negotiators. Can you assist us with why it would be shared with the NFSP?
I think the previous policies were, maybe as a matter of courtesy, but also in terms of engagement and input. I don't personally recall the meetings, but there would have been meetings to have had that. I'm guessing, I suppose, that the involvement would be agents are implicated by the policy, and therefore the Federation would.
And that was typical, was it, of these kinds of policy documents, that they would be agreed with the NFSP?
Yeah.
Can we look at page 4, please, which is the introduction and purpose? Looking there, perhaps the second substantive paragraph or your own recollection, can you summarise for us briefly the purpose of this policy?
And I guess it goes back to the original policy, as I said, probably late 1990s, which I think, from recollection, was a policy that was developed in the Midlands region of the 7 regional teams. And then when those regions were effectively disbanded into a new organisational structure, that policy was redesigned into a business policy. And similar to the regional audit structure review, I think it was designed to aid some consistency in decision making and interpretation of existing policies.
If we scroll down, there's section 2, prevention of losses. And in essence, it says there that there should be good accounting practices to prevent losses in branches. That's the most effective way of reducing losses. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
And it's over the page to section 3 that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this afternoon. Can I ask you to look at the first 2 paragraphs there and to read those perhaps to yourself and to take us through those first 2 paragraphs?
Okay.
What do you understand, in summary, that to mean?
If a sub-postmaster can identify an error, knows that it is likely to lead to an error notice or transaction correction, and can sort of substantiate that, then that would provide them with the circumstances where they could seek authority to hold it in suspense.
And looking at that second paragraph, it says that under circumstances where the exact cause of the loss is known and a compensating error is expected to be returned, losses may be held in the suspense account. Am I to read into that losses can only be held in a suspense account if the exact cause is known?
Yes.
If we look at then the third paragraph, it says, before moving a specific accounting discrepancy to the suspense account, authority must be sought from the agent's debt team 3 via the MBSC. If there's no clearly defined evidence of a known error, and therefore no error notice likely to be issued, authority will not be given.
Okay.
So again, reading that, it seems that if there isn't a clearly defined evidence of a known error, authority won't be given to transfer into the suspense account. Is that correct?
That's how I would read it, yeah.
If we look at that from another way round, if there was an unknown error, so a bug, error or defect that wasn't known to the NBSC, is it right to say that the sub-postmaster would have to make good that discrepancy?
I think that's how I'd interpret it.
If we move down to the 6th paragraph, begins to give. To give authority to hold losses within the suspense account, even with evidence of the error, is against the principle of right first time. Granting authority to hold amounts in suspense should, therefore, always be considered to be the exception rather than the norm. Agents are expected to address the underlying cause of misbalancing and must expect that any subsequent errors of a similar nature will be referred to the retail line for corrective action. So it seems there that agents are expected to address the underlying cause, even if that is, for example, a technical fault.
Yeah, I think at this stage we probably it was written on the basis of a transactional error that was made at the branch. Either the sub-postmaster knew about it or they didn't know about it, as opposed to a system error.
And if it was applied to a system error, it's a little harsh, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, this was probably written at a time when it wasn't considered that there were to be bugs or glitches in the system which would cause those types of errors.
And is that because it was likely to have been drafted in the very early stages of Horizon, or drafted by...
The policy initially was written pre-Horizon, and a lot of these, if you compare previous versions, you'll probably find a lot of similarity in the language used.
So some of the pre-Horizon language would have been copied into this without thought being given to bugs, errors and defects?
Possibly, yes.
If we go over to page 8, please. There is a section on Horizon issues, so presumably that is a new section post the implementation of Horizon or rollout of Horizon, or certainly in the development, at least the development stages of Horizon. Yeah. I'm going to read to you, I'll take each paragraph separately. The first is, if an agent feels that an error has occurred via the Horizon system, it's essential that this is reported to the Horizon System Help Desk. The HSH will only consider the incident for further investigation if the branch has evidence of a system fault. If no evidence is available, the case will not be investigated and the agent will be held responsible for making good the loss. How would a sub-postmaster be able to show that there was a system fault?
I don't know that they could.
Do you think it was fair to place that kind of a burden on a sub-postmaster?
Looking to now, absolutely not.
I'll read the second paragraph. System faults are very rare and are normally identified after full investigation has been undertaken. All known system errors are managed through the MBSC, or Network Support Problem Management, sorry. Access to problem management is via the MBSC. If the agent feels the issue is not being resolved, they should flag the issue up with the MBSC. If a known system error has caused a shortage, the agent should be given authority to hold the loss in suspense until the system error has been reconciled and an error notice issued. Now, this was drafted or produced in 2003. We know from the Bates and others litigation, the group action, and the judgment of Mr. Justice Fraser, that there are a number of bugs, errors and defects prior to that date. So in 2000, there was the calendar square bug. There was something called the data tree build failure discrepancies in 1999 and 2000. There were gyro bank discrepancies in 2000, counter replacement issues in 2000 and 2002, phantom transactions in 2001, that's something that I will come back to, reconciliation issues in 2000 and 2002, something called concurrent logins in 1999 and 2000. So where did the line that system faults are very rare come from?
I'm not entirely sure. And having read it myself in preparation for my witness statement, it wasn't clear to me where that language came from. Going back to the input, where that input would have come from. Some of those glitches, bugs you named, at the time, I wasn't aware of them. And so I suspect other people probably weren't aware of them. So even though there were possibly people within Fujitsu and post offices that were, many people were not.
And the language, the specific word system faults are very rare. Was that something that you think you may have drafted having been provided that information, or do you think that's somebody else's drafting?
It feels like part of the business input. I would have been told system faults are very rare.
And who by?
I'm not sure. If you go back to the input, it might help.
So perhaps if we look at page 1, in the middle of the page, there's business input.
So many of those names, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what their roles were. A lot of them fall under the security team or the product and branch accounting team. For the last 5 names, I don't recall what their roles were.
And we have their assurance, Tony Marsh. Would Tony Marsh have read and signed off this document?
Absolutely. Well, he should have done.
Where would you likely have received information about the operation of the system? So faults in the system. Are you able to assist broadly, even if it's not a name of an individual, the department that might have contributed
I can't
to
recall
that?
where that information came from.
Do you remember any discussions about that wording?
No.
Can we look back again at page 8, please? Sticking to that second paragraph, we have in that first sentence, normally identified after a full investigation has been undertaken. Again, was that something that you would have drafted?
I clearly would have drafted it. I don't know where that wording would have come from.
How would you have satisfied yourself of the accuracy of that statement?
I guess talking to those people who are given the input, and also, talking to, in this case, Tony Marsh, the business owner of the policy.
And are there any specific discussions that you recall regarding that, whether it's in relation to the production of this policy or just in broader terms, that somebody providing you with reassurance that system faults are very rare and normally identified after full investigation?
I think there were just business messages coming out from top down to say Horizon's been a success, these millions of transactions are being performed, and so it was kind of a message coming through various channels that was saying, if there are any system issues that you're hearing about, they're very rare.
You say top down. I mean, we've discussed earlier, you were involved in, say, the Post Office Risk and Compliance Committee.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that was a message that was being reached by that committee or being passed down by that committee?
I can't recall at those committee meetings ever having discussion about Horizon issues at all. I may be wrong, but I can't recall those discussions. I think the messages I'm talking about with top down are just messages from directors from the board and the ET.
And you say passed down. How would it have been transferred, that information?
Just through various channels. I mean, they would have workshops where they would have leadership, senior managers attending, giving key messages for the next year. That could have been a key message from those workshops.
Do you remember the names of any individuals who you can recall having given those messages?
I can't.
I just want to sum up what we've been through in relation to this particular policy. And I'm just going to put a few points, and it may be that you can just answer these yes or no. If you need to give more detail, then feel free, but I think it may be that they can be answered just yes or no. Is it right to say that under this policy, the burden was on the sub-postmaster to show that there was a system fault?
Under this policy, rightly or wrongly, that's what it says.
Second, that if they didn't have evidence of a system fault, it wouldn't be investigated by the help desk. And that's the first paragraph that we see there, the final sentence.
I'm not sure that's true, but that's what the policy says.
And is there something you have in mind?
No, I'm just thinking that there may well be things that the sub-postmaster is not aware of being investigated. That's the only thing I can think of.
But applying that policy, if
Yeah.
there was a system fault, and if they didn't have evidence, it wouldn't be investigated.
If they believe a system fault's to blame and they don't have a reason for it or can provide evidence for it, that policy would suggest it wouldn't be investigated.
Third, the way that they were directed to address this was through the MBSC. Is that correct?
Can you repeat your question?
Certainly. So they were directed, if we look at the page before, page 5, it was the third paragraph there, that sub-postmasters would be asked to direct this to the MBSC. the third paragraph before moving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if there was any issue, any description that the branch wanted to raise, it would always go through the MBSC initially.
Fourth, that the sub-postmaster would have to pay the shortfall if they couldn't prove that there was a system fault.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
That's the correct assumption from how this reads.
Fifth, that only if there was a known system error could the loss be held in the suspense account.
Yes, correct.
And sixth, that the working assumption, as we've seen on the next, on section 6, was that system faults were rare and would have been identified. And that's not just in the policy or written in the policy, but by the sound of it, that is the general working assumption.
I think at that stage that was a general working assumption.
And does it follow then that if there was an unknown error, a sub-postmaster would have to pay up?
Yes.
And that there was a reliance on the MBSC to identify known errors?
Or to at least log the issue and whatever resolution policy they had in place to put in place.
If we look back at section 3 and the authority to hold losses, is it right to say that the ability to hold apparent losses in the suspense account was intentionally restrictive?
Yes, I think initially, again going back to pre-Horizon days, it was often used for the wrong reasons, and they had lots of amounts being held in there. So it was used, or was supposed to be used, for specific cases where there were known errors, awaiting transaction corrections or error notices.
And ultimately, following the evidence that you've already given, it wasn't for the auditor to look into any of this, because the auditor's job was principally to look and see if X equaled Y.
If you're talking about an audit discrepancy, absolutely. So the auditor would find the discrepancy, if there was one, and then there could be a number of reasons why there was a discrepancy. The sub-postmaster would be expected to make good, unless they could identify this is the reason why.
And this policy, was that information that was being communicated to sub-postmasters by auditors?
I think not necessarily the policy, but historically there'd always been, within the sub-postmaster's contract, 2 or 3 paragraphs, maybe more, that outlined the contractual obligations. So I think auditors always have that phrase in mind from the contract, rather than necessarily the policy that's here.
But the burdens in terms of identifying known errors and, for example, the assumption that system faults were rare, do you think those were messages that were communicated to sub-postmasters by auditors on visits?
I don't believe they would have talked about Horizon issues being rare. They wouldn't have talked about those issues. Fact-finding was what they were due to do. So if the sub-postmaster said, I believe this is the reason why, I would expect the auditors to log that in the report.
I mean, surely there would have been a conversation on occasion between auditors and sub-postmasters about what the policy says or about the post office's approach.
I think the only time the contractual obligation would come up is if there is a shortage, and the sub-postmaster would probably know their contractual obligation without the auditor having to remind them of it.
And looking back now at that policy, do you think that the approach that was taken under that policy to sub-postmasters was fair?
No, absolutely not. Because as you have highlighted or alluded to, the onus in this policy was upon sub-postmasters to prove something that they could not prove, or probably could not prove. So it doesn't feel fair.
Thank you. I'm going to change the subject slightly now and look at the impact programme very briefly.
Mm-hmm.
It's related because we've spoken about discrepancies and how they went into the suspense account when, for example, there was a known error. Do you recall that changing under what, I think you referred to it as the branch trading, I think we call it the impact programme.
Yes, I think when I saw that in the bundle, I wasn't entirely sure what that referred to. But for me, I think impact related to a weekly balancing programme moving into a monthly branch trading programme.
So the removal of the suspense account is, do you have a phrase for it, or?
What phrase would you like me to give?
No, well, I mean, you refer to branch trading. Is that something set different?
No. Branch trading is just, as I said, the evolution of weekly cash accounting. But the suspense account, in terms of impact, I think the plan was to remove that partly to avoid amounts being put in there without authority.
And were you involved in that programme?
Not as such, but I remember having a meeting to discuss how that would affect branches and, from my point of view, how auditors would see the difference.
And can you briefly summarise your views on that?
I think at the time I was assured that transaction corrections, I think that's part of the evolution from error notice transaction corrections, that transaction corrections would always be provided with evidence that cannot be disputed effectively. And on the very rare occasions that there was no evidence or insufficient evidence, there's a channel for that to be disputed. I'm not sure, with hindsight, that was, the way things went. And I was assured at the time, but subsequently I think there were still cases of transaction corrections being issued without the appropriate evidence.
Do you recall who those discussions were with and who assured you?
It's very strange. I can visualise being in the room with a member of the product and branch accounting team. I can't. It could be one of two names, but I can't be certain who it was.
We've heard from somebody called Susan Harding.
It wasn't her.
Did Susan Harding or any of her team ask you for your views on that programme?
Well, the person I think it was called Marie Cockett. She may have worked within that team. And I remember having a meeting with her to talk through how this would work.
Do you recall the use of the Settle Centrally button to fill the void left by that programme? Because we've spoken about the suspense account and the use of it for known errors. Were you aware of the Settle Centrally button being used to, in effect, fill that void?
Yep.
And what was your view on that?
Again, it was supported by being assured that transaction corrections would be supplied with evidence. So if they were provided with evidence that was satisfactory, then why wouldn't you settle centrally if that was your chosen option to do so? I think the gap for me is that if there wasn't evidence, then what would you do?
Can we look at poll 00105418, please? And it's page 15. This is a number of different documents of, but it's page 15 that I'd like to look at. This is a document that was in your bundle. It's an email to Lynn Hobbs. Do you remember who Lynn Hobbs was at all?
Yes, I remember Lynn.
And what was her role?
Well, I know she was a senior manager within the network directorate. Can't remember her precise role title.
And how about John Breeden?
He worked for her in her directorate.
Can I ask you to look at the second paragraph and perhaps read that to yourself? And I'd just like you to talk us through the views that are expressed there from yourself. Can you assist us with why you're referred to there?
I'm not entirely sure, and I think I've seen a similar note in another part of the bundle with my reference named, and I think in that case it mentioned, because here it says totally against, in that case it said something similar but different in wording. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure whether my name was used to endorse their approach or to back their approach, or to say that I was an obstacle to their approach. I can't read from that paragraph what my reference was there for.
Are you able to assist us with how it happened that something that was established in the policy in terms of treatment of cash account losses policy and the use of a suspense account for known errors, for example, how that became seen after the impact programme and replaced by the Settle Centrally button, how the use of that Settle Centrally button became somehow inherently suspicious to the Post Office?
I'm not sure I would see it as suspicious, but equally it could still be open to abuse, where people click on the button just to get it out of the account.
Do you think that there was a change in attitude at any point?
Possibly so. I mean, over time, people change roles, people change views. So I'm not entirely sure, and obviously the system has changed. But yes, I think it may well be that it was considered that, a bit like the suspense account, it was open to being abused.
And do you have any views on that now?
To be honest, it's difficult to go back to that time frame to think through what I was thinking. And I know my name's been quoted. I don't personally remember a conversation with John anyway, but I suppose it reflects that my concern would be, if you remove that facility to settle centrally, then there's no transparency in what's going to happen. Because if you haven't got the facility to say, I'm going to accept it, even if that's not what you do, there's no record of what happened in that situation.
And you were aware, presumably, that the Settle Centrally button was used by people both who did accept, but also those who didn't accept the amount?
Well, it definitely could be, yeah.
And one of the purposes of that was to enable the sub-postmaster to balance.
Exactly.
I'd like to move on now to bugs, errors, and defects. We started today, this morning, by looking at what you wrote in your witness statement about that, and we discussed it. And there's one particular incident that I'd like to talk to you about this afternoon, and that relates to the Two-Ball Lonnon post office in Newcastle. I apologise if my pronunciation of that is incorrect. You've been provided with a number of different documents in that respect, and I'm going to start with poll 00104600. Do you remember, and I'll take you to the document in due course, but you're mentioned in one of these documents. Mm-hmm. Is this an issue that's broadly familiar to you, even if it's just because we provided you with the documents recently?
I remember the name of the branch. I don't remember the detail. And even having looked through the thread of emails, the actual issue itself, isn't particularly familiar, but the branch's name is, so clearly there is some information that was available to me at the time.
My purpose for taking you to this incident is that there are a number of ways in which this issue was dealt with that I'd like to ask you about, and it may refresh your memory of particular issues that cropped up. And this is just really being used as an example. Mm-hmm. This document here is from the 4th of April 2000, and so that's early in the life of Horizon. And I think you've already explained who Lynn Hobbs was.
Well, she worked as a senior manager in the network.
Yes, and Keith Baines.
The name's familiar, but I can't think who it would be, his role.
Now, there is a significant loss in this branch. I'm just going to read you one paragraph, or some of the first paragraph. It says, both officers have recently have received additional support from HFSOs, that's Horizon Field Support Officers. Is that right?
Yep,
Yep.
that's right.
Who investigated the cash account to the best of their ability and could not identify any reasons for the shortages. I'm told by TP, what's TP?
That would be transaction processing, which would then become product and branch accounting.
I'm told by transaction processing that no outstanding error notices exist for these offices and that, in their opinion, they can't identify any system problems for the errors. The worst of the two is 2 Ball Lonnon with an outstanding loss of. Now, I think that figure is in fact incorrect, and we'll see why, but I think that's meant to be £64,000 rather than £647,000.
Okay. I saw it at 64 anyway.
Yes. And then there's a second office. Both offices are run by the same multiple, Nigel Mills, who has a number of other offices in my area. In both instances, comments were made by HFSOs about migration errors that would generate error notices, and consequently the sub-postmaster is now refusing to pay the loss. I know very little about the system, but in the case of 2 Ball Lonnon, this office migrated on a Wednesday, etc., etc. Are those kinds of issues ones that you recall being experienced by sub-postmasters?
I kind of had reflection that at the time there's always a sense of there could well be migration issues, and there could be a number of aspects to it. There could be a branch that when they migrated already had a problem, or there could be something about the way that the system migrates. So I think there was always a sense of that changeover from a manual system to the Horizon system could bring up some issues.
If we look at the final couple of sentences in that paragraph, it says, in the case of both offices, the help desk suggested that the system was experiencing problems, which would eventually be resolved and an error notice would be generated. RNMs, what is RNMs?
It's an acronym for Retail Network Managers. So it was at that point the liaison between post office and the branch. Each branch was assigned, I guess, a retail network manager.
So regional network managers' knowledge of the system was extremely limited, and these assurances were therefore accepted and the offices allowed to carry the amounts in their suspense accounts. And if we scroll down to
Can I just interrupt there? Because
Absolutely.
I think it's just useful to say you've just called, you've read out that sentence, the retail network manager's knowledge of the system was extremely limited. I think at that period in time, I think the knowledge of the system was limited for a lot of people in the post office, auditors, trainers, investigators. I think we were learning as the system was rolled out.
Thank you. The final paragraph there says, I don't believe we should write off almost 70,000. That's why it may be 64,000 rather than 640,000. Without evidence that the system somehow created these errors and they are just paper errors. Can we go to another document, same topic? It's poll 00104596. We're still in 2000 here. Now we're in June 2000. And can we turn over the page, please, to page 2? From Keith Baines to Lynn Hobbs, for 2 Ball Lonnon, should the investigation include the 19,000 in outstanding error notices or just the 45,000 authorised cash shortage? And at that time, we can see Keith Baines was head of Horizon Commercial.
Right.
Can we go back to page 1, please, and have a look at the bottom of that page? Lynn Hobbs says, Keith, I'd like to include both as the errors in P&As occurred during the same period as the shortages which the office is claiming are due to the system and which we think may be down to in-house fraud. Pausing there, do you remember, was it common for branches to be complaining that errors are due to the system?
I'm not sure common, but it had been heard. I had from auditors feedback to say there was a discrepancy and the sub-postmaster believed it to be a system error.
Thank you. So that, in fact, is April 2000, and then it's the first email in this chain at the top of the page where we're in June 2000. So that's a couple of months later, and this is where your name is mentioned. So Lynn says, Keith, as we discussed these two offices at our last meeting, and you said you would send me the information forwarded to audits. I've not received anything to date, and despite trying both Chris Painter and Martin Ferlinc, I have been unable to find anyone in audits who has any recollection of having received information about them. Just pausing there, do you remember being chased at all about this?
No.
Is that a no?
No. Sorry.
I've received copies of an audit summary for each office for audits carried out on the 13th of April. And again, pausing there, audit summary, what do you understand by an audit summary?
I'm assuming that she means an audit report for the branch. Just going back to your previous comment, did I recall being chased? I'm not entirely sure what I'm being chased for. It says not being able to find anyone in audits who has any recollection of having received any information about them being the two branches, I'm assuming.
Yes.
But I'm not sure what sort of information she's expecting.
So you don't remember the incident, and also you don't...
No, but I do remember, I don't remember the second branch's name, but the two board on, and I do remember the name, and I can't think why that would come to light.
Thank you. The audit summary, though, is that something that would be, you could produce in branch from the Horizon system?
No, as I say, I think this is a written report. I'm guessing what she means by an audit summary. I can't think of anything else other than an audit report. So at the end of each audit, the auditor would write a report in Word and email it to network management. And in the case of a sub-postmaster at the time, it will be sent by post to them.
So an audit summary wouldn't, for example, identify the cause of an issue if it was, say, a technical issue?
No, all it would say is this is the discrepancy and where it can be identified what the discrepancy is. So it might be a case of there's a £15,000 discrepancy, 10,000 is cash inflation, 3,000 is incorrect foreign currency listings. So it break down what was known, but then it also have, unknown discrepancy.
So it would give you the numbers, but not the cause of the discrepancy.
Exactly.
This email continues, it's now over a year since these offices went live, and we really do need to resolve these shortages. Not surprisingly, the sub-postmaster, who has about 10 offices in my area, is unhappy with what he perceives the lack of progress. Can you forward the information sent to audits to me and confirm who in audits is dealing with this? I'm going to take you to another document in the same chain, Poll 001045597. 20th of June 2000. I'm going to read to you from that first paragraph. It says, I was looking to have their transaction information interrogated to try and understand how the errors could have occurred. Pausing there, so they're looking into how they've occurred. Is it, at that stage, was that the job of the retail network or the head of the retail network, for example?
I don't believe so, and I don't know how it would be possible to be able to eliminate every possible cause.
I thought this was what we discussed in terms of obtaining information from Pathway, which would only normally be available if we suspected a fraud. What I've received from you is a list of the calls made to the Horizon System helpline on behalf of the office over the period since go live. I assume the information I've received is available basically at the touch of a button rather than as a special request, which we may have to pay a special payment for. I'm sorry to say that I don't feel I'm any further forward with these offices. So it seems as though Lynn Hobbs is trying to get to the bottom of the discrepancy, has been provided with something equivalent to what you as an auditor may have been able to obtain from the system itself.
I'm not sure whether this is referring to the ARQ data, because she refers to the data only being available, trying to find the words now, if we suspected a fraud. So that's where the investigators would be involved, and they would have the route to obtain that detailed transactional data.
So the complaint is that she's received a list of the calls made to the helpline, but not something more substantive from Fujitsu.
I think what Lynn makes there is a valid point, that there's a gap in the process there, in that if a discrepancy involves an investigation, then that triggers off obtaining more detailed data. If it doesn't, then there's a gap because nobody's pursuing that data.
Absolutely, and that was precisely the question that I was leading to, which is looking back at your time where you have the job that was being carried out by auditors. Do you think that there was a missing job description, effectively, which is a more technical auditor or someone with technical knowledge who could investigate technical matters?
Yeah. I mean, if I could go back 20 years, I'd do some things very differently. And I'm just highlighting on some of the things here. So yes, absolutely a gap between the discrepancies involving investigators or not. And I think there could have been and should have been a role for auditors to fill that gap, but it needs the technical expertise which wouldn't have been there. Lynn also mentions about getting details of logs to the Horizon helpline, but also for MBSC, you know, we could and should have been able to access that information so that when we identified an audit loss of X amount, we could then say, but this branch has been reporting issues for the last 20 weeks. And for whatever reason, we either didn't feel that was available, that data, or for what, you know, I don't know what the reason was, but for me there's a gap there in terms of being able to identify that sort of information that could have been available.
Thank you. I'll take you just to one or two more documents in this chain before we end that particular example. That's poll 00104-597. Thank you. We're still in June 2000, and Keith Baines is there emailing Lynn Hobbs. He says, in order to get detailed information from the system, either special audit functions can be used at the outlet, or for older data, a request has to be made to Pathway by our internal auditors. There's a documented process for this, which from a PO point of view is owned by audit. So where it's talking about audit there, that's not talking about network audit, which is your team. That's talking about the separate...
No, I'm confused because I wasn't sure whether that meant the investigation part, because they would trigger off the request, or whether it meant, and it would now be Royal Mail internal audit. I personally feel it would mean the investigators.
So it may be that audit is being referred to there, but in fact they mean investigators, or what's your reading?
I think in the original documentation from Fujitsu, it referred to post office internal auditors without perhaps understanding our structure of where we drew a line between audit finishing and investigation starting.
And it seems there a rather binary choice, that if it is current, it can be obtained from Horizon, and only if it's older data can a request be made to Pathway. Is that a distinction that you remember at all?
Yes, in the sense of at the branch, data was available, and I can't remember how many days, but perhaps for a trading statement's worth of days, 40 days or something like that. And then any data beyond that period of time would not be accessible in the branch, so you would have to request it from Fujitsu, or Pathway in this case.
I'm going to read on. It says, the process envisages an auditor visiting the outlet in the first place to examine the data held locally. Auditors can log on with a special password that gives them access to additional reports not available to other users. Do you think this might be a misunderstanding of the auditor's role, or do you think this is an accurate description of what an auditor could have done?
I'm wondering whether it's a misunderstanding of me, either now or then, as to what an auditor can access, because my understanding was that an auditor could access everything that a manager at the branch could access. This is suggesting that there's additional activity that they could access. Now, I don't know whether that's true or whether my memory is failing me, but I thought that auditors could only access what a postmaster or a branch manager could access themselves.
And then the third paragraph, he says, then if access to centrally archived data is required, the auditor will complete a specification form setting out the data required, e.g. what data types, what period, etc. Pathway can cope with a maximum of 7 requests per month. My understanding is that a request could cover more than one outlet, so to maximise the use of the limited number of available, a coordinated approach is desirable. For each request, Pathway will extract the relevant records from their data warehouse. The data is provided more or less in its raw, unprocessed form, so interpretation will take time and needs someone with a thorough understanding of the audit trail specification. So again, he's referring there to auditors completing a specification form.
So either, as I said, I'd misunderstood this, and actually there was a facility for auditors to access information beyond what is available to the branch, or this refers to investigators. It talks about a maximum of 7 requests per month, and I don't know if that ties in with the requests for ARQ data that investigators say they can only have so many requests. I don't know if it's per month or whatever.
And do you recall that limitation on the number of reports that could be obtained from Fujitsu?
I don't remember the number, but I know there was a limitation.
Do you recall Pol's approach to that limitation? Were there concerns about the limited number? Was it just accepted?
And I don't recall whether after that number there was a charge, so that there might have been the ability to have more than that number but chargeable. I don't remember Pol's approach to that.
And the reference at the end of this email, the data is provided more or less in its raw, unprocessed form, so interpretation will take time and needs someone with a thorough understanding of the audit trail specification. From the evidence that you've given today, it doesn't seem as though that is the kind of job that could have been done by an auditor.
No, we didn't have that skill set to perform that sort of role. Not to say we couldn't have achieved it, but equally I don't feel that we had it.
Can we look at poll 000933128, please? This is still with Tubal Lonnan. Here we're in August 2001, so quite a considerable time later. And this is an email from the retail line manager. And he says, it may help you to understand my concern if I explain there's an ongoing dispute about shortages at this office. The sub-postmaster is blaming the Horizon system for the shortages. And then we have reference there to concerns, the issue concerning advice given by the Post Office helpline to the OIC, I presume is officer in the case.
Officer in charge.
Or officer in charge. Tracy Dowson, is that somebody you recall?
No, I think that's the person in charge of the branch. The branch.
They wouldn't be referred to as the OIC, would they?
This advice given from Post Office Helpline to the officer in charge, Tracy Dowson.
Yeah.
So the officer in charge being the person in charge of the branch.
The officer in charge of investigating the branch?
No.
Or you're saying it's...
So, because it's a nominee sub-postmaster, it's not a sub-postmaster, it's a nominee.
Yes.
They will have their own branch manager, for want of a better phrase. The term officer in charge is just referring to that person, the person in charge of that branch.
And can you just remind us why there would be a nominee sub-postmaster?
So a nominee sub-postmaster would, I can't think of a particular company involved, but it would be a company that would have perhaps 300 or 400 branches under their name. And so they would be the nominee sub-postmaster, even though they've got 300 or 400 branches. So at each of their branches, they would employ a manager to run their branch.
And I'm just going to read from her report. She says, I spoke to Carl, who was very helpful, but still no answers. He said it was a ghost figure in the system. I proceeded to roll the figures over and was told that Carl would contact myself on the Thursday morning. After the phone call, he told me he had spoken to his manager and they were happy it would show as a shortage next week. The explanation given is that it was a ghost figure that had got into the system, but they didn't know how. Now, did you ever hear the term ghost figures?
I don't recall hearing it at the time. I've heard it since, and obviously since I've left the post office and this trial I've heard those terms, but I don't recall at the time hearing those terms.
If we scroll down in the message from the retail line manager, he says, clearly remarks about ghost figures in the system attributable to our own staff are not likely to inspire confidence in Horizon, and in this case may prove very damaging. We talked about a bug earlier called the phantom transaction bug. Were these kinds of issues reaching your desk?
No. And the emails that you show me, I've not had sight of those emails, and particularly those emails where my name's been inside them. You know, I would have expected to have had some visibility copied into those emails.
Did you see it as part of your function to draw together themes from various audits, words that we used, such as ghost transactions, or themes of bugs, errors and defects that may have been raised by sub-postmasters?
I think that there should have been a greater role in bringing together themes. As I said to you earlier, I think we could have had a role in looking at the logs of calls made to MBSC and trying to analyse what sort of calls are being made. Having said that, I would expect MBSC and their management to be doing that as well, to be able to say, look, we've had all these calls in the last month, these are the issues. They may have been doing that, but the outputs were not reaching my desk.
Thank you. I think that might be an appropriate moment for a break. I only have about 15 minutes worth of questions after the break. There will be some questions from other call participants. But Sarah, are you content for us to take a 15-minute break now?
Yes, I am. That's fine.
Thank you very much. There we go. Thank you. Can we now look at poll 000214220? Mr. Ferlinc, we were talking before the break about the need for some sort of macro analysis or drawing together various strings. I'm now going to move on to your time on the Risk and Compliance Committee, or I think you said this morning that you attended but weren't on the committee, or something along those lines.
I attended many, if not most of the meeting, but I don't think I was considered a member.
This particular example is the 22nd of March 2006. And if we turn to page 3, it has your name. Now, it appears that that's one that you didn't attend, but it does refer to you. Mm-hmm. Or certainly you're not listed in the members or in attendance. Is this something you recall at all?
I'm not sure if, because there's 3 paragraphs there, and it says close afterwards. I don't know if that's just the whole action has been closed, in which case there seems to be a summary of the analysis done. But as I've touched on before and you've highlighted, I think there needed to be greater analysis done. One of the things that I feel was missing, perhaps, was to look at sort of post-event analysis. What I mean by that is, if we have a branch where a sub-postmaster is accumulating losses week after week after week, and that results in their suspension, and someone else takes over the branch, I think was a big gap to look at the branch performance with the new person in charge. Because if those losses continued, that would suggest, well, perhaps it's nothing to do with the sub-postmaster. There's something in the branch that needs to be looked at. Conversely, if the losses suddenly stopped, that might also give some information as well. And I don't think that analysis was ever thought through at the time to look at branches' performance after a change of ownership.
And why not?
I'm not sure.
And
I look at it today and think that feels so obvious as a piece of activity to have done, and relatively simple to look at 80 branches. Potentially those 80 branches would have ended up with new people in charge to sort of track their performance over the next 6-12 months to see, is the profile of the branch's performance the same or different, and what does that tell us? And I just think that was a lost opportunity.
So if we look at this as an example, the kind of macro analysis that was taking place was, for example, analysing 80 branches with the largest shortages, rather than looking at follow-on from suspension or looking at particular bugs that have been referred to by different sub-postmasters.
It would just been simply a bit of number crunching, identifying that these branches had a similar sort of profile. So they might have all had information in the risk model that suggested there was an issue in cash declarations, or it could have been they were all rural branches. I guess that's what the analysis would have looked at that stage.
Can we look at poll 0002141, please? This is another meeting of the Risk and Compliance Committee on the 6th of September 2006. You're listed on this occasion as in attendance. Mm-hmm. And if we look at the summary action points, and it's 0904, it says there to analyse those branches where financial irregularity has been revealed during 2006/7 to ascertain if there are any common profiles, and your name is there as the lead on that.
I think, again, it probably just goes back to what I said before. I think this was looking at the profiles of those branches where there was an irregularity. So was there a particular stream in the risk model that suggested that was a concern? Were there different types of that branch also in the risk model that we should target? Basically, I think that links to the previous activity.
And there were annual reviews. I mean, if we look at poll 000-33398, for example, I won't take you to any particular pages, but I mean, you did produce reviews. Why didn't those reviews address those kinds of issues?
I think this particular review on the quality of auditing was triggered by the movement of the audit teams to the network. I think I personally had expressed a reservation of the move to a directorate in terms of potential conflict of interest, auditors, auditing branches where they might have also trained the same branch. So as part of that, I think to mitigate that concern, there was a sense of, well, let's go and do a piece of work to see whether there is any concern about the auditing quality. And just to, I think I might have mentioned in my statement at some point, probably the mid-2000s, when I was heading the auditing team, my team was reviewed, audited by the internal audit team. So it's kind of followed that theme of someone auditing the auditors.
I mean, if I was to draw the themes together from some of your evidence today, certainly when you began, you talked about the size of the team and it reducing over time, especially in the late 1990s onwards. And you've talked about auditors not being able to cover as many or carry out as many audits as they previously had. Is funding or the sufficiency of the numbers of your team in any way to blame for that lack of analysis, or is it something else?
I think a couple of things. I think, yeah, absolutely. Cost reduction, headcount reduction throughout the 2000s put pressure on, limiting resource with increased demand. So as we went into financial services, there were more demands on compliance activities. So you've got those two pressures of more auditing requirements. Product managers wanted their products audited against limiting resource. And then we got the skill set. So I would have liked to have seen a broader, wider skill set, more qualified skill set, which challenged against the headcount reduction. So those kind of two aspects created the challenge.
And did you raise those concerns with anybody?
I would have raised it with my line manager. I think everybody, though, was in the same position. My line manager was under pressure to reduce resource. Everybody across the business had those challenges.
When you refer to your line manager, do you mean Tony Marsh or Rod Ismay?
At that time, it would have been Keith Woolard.
The very final document I'm going to take you to, I think, postdates your time. It's poll 000866765. It may postdate. I don't know if this is a document that's familiar to you at all.
Only because I've seen it in the bundle, but it was quite a long time after my time, I think.
And if we look there is an analysis of the audit team. And the second bullet point on the left-hand side, it says audit activity is restricted to the checking of cash and stock and the validation of procedural compliance questions. Is that something that you agree with as a concern?
I mean, this is another review of I'm assuming this is the internal audit team reviewing the auditors. But yeah, in terms of that paragraph, audit activity was very much focused on asset verification and compliance procedural checks.
And the asset verification would have made sense pre-Horizon because you're counting physical numbers that are in stock in a branch. But did that make less sense post-Horizon?
I don't think so, because there still needs to be some assurance that the cash is at the branch. There still needs to be some assurance that our assets are safeguarded. So I don't think it follows that there's less validity.
But was the audit team ill-equipped for the additional challenge of Horizon and data from Horizon?
I think, as I said earlier, across the board, I think there were challenges with a group of personnel who hadn't grown up with technology at their fingertips and learning, quite steeply in this learning curve.
And if we look on the right-hand side under weaknesses, if we look at number 2, poor management information, only statistics of visit numbers get reported. Number 6, currently not a professional audit service. Are these concerns that you recognise at all?
Well, in terms of 2, again, I don't know what the management information is looking like. There was a bit more than statistics when I was involved, but I don't know what it looked like in, what period is this, 2013? Not sure it says.
I don't think it says the date. If we go to page 3, please, on the bottom of page 3, that addresses number 4. It says there, the auditing effort in network is primarily focused around checking cash and testing counter-staff compliance with statutory and contractual requirements. The network support team is made up of approximately 220 FTE that are utilised to conduct a mix of audit work and training. The majority of staff are drawn from post office counters, although some have been sub-postmasters. All new staff receive detailed induction training. This is over the page. However, based on our review, none of the staff have any formal audit qualifications, nor do they have any professional audit training or experience prior to their appointment. Are those concerns that you shared or share now?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, our team was filled with resource purely based upon a background of counter and to some extent cash centre experience. But post-Horizon, I mentioned in my witness statement, or pre-Horizon, that was quite a valuable resource. People who knew how counters worked, they knew how the cash account worked, they'd been working in branches. Post-Horizon, they didn't know how Horizon worked other than the training that they were afforded.
And finally, in that second box, about halfway down, it says, no detailed issue or trend information is produced to better inform management of possible systemic issues, strengths of weaknesses or of control or management of risk across the business or within areas/regions. Again, is that something that I think you would agree with from the evidence that you've given?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, this is what, 5 years after the audit teams left me and 2 years after I left the business. But I think it feels like a fairly common view that was shared prior to me leaving.
Thank you. There will be questions from other core participants, but is there anything, having seen all of that and all the evidence we've been through today, anything that you would like to raise with the chair?
I don't think so.
No. Thank you very much. Sir, do you have any questions before we move to core participants?
No, thank you, no.
Thank you. I'll start with Ms. Page.
Hello, it's Flora Page. I'm representing a number of the sub-postmasters, and I want to ask you particularly about Nicola Arch. It's probably not a name that you know, but she was a sub-postmaster who was amongst the same very early pilot as the Two-Ball Lonnon branch. Mm-hmm. So in that very, very early stage, long before most of the rest of the network received Horizon, she and the Two-Ball Lonnon branch were both in that first wave. And just like them, she suffered doubling up problems. And the same sort of problems, if we dig down into that Two-Ball Lonnon correspondence, what we see is a doubling up problem. And she experienced that in that same wave of rollout. But when her branch suffered doubling up, she was prosecuted. Now, her branch was a single, or a singleton, as I think they were sometimes known, whereas, of course, Two-Ball Lonnon was part of this big chain. And it seems that, as a result of being part of a big chain, Two-Ball Lonnon got completely different treatment. Do you think that there is a risk or a likelihood that sub-postmasters who ran single offices were treated less fairly because they were small, less noticeable, more easy to run over, as it were?
I'm not sure that's the case, and I can understand why that might be perceived that way. I think my concern, if I can just sort of broaden that point, I think, is that for people who ran offices on their own, singletons, I don't think the support structure was there, particularly in terms of Horizon rollout. If I'm working at a Crown office and my branch has been rolled over to Horizon, I've got people around me to talk to. I'm having a problem with this transaction, what do I do? When you're a single sub-postmaster, you're on your own, and yes, you've got a phone call away, but it's not the same thing as having someone to turn to. So I think just sidestepping your question in itself, I think there was perhaps a lack of support and understanding of how single sub-postmasters needed to be supported differently. So I understand that view potentially of how multiples, nominee sub-postmasters were perhaps treated differently, but I think single sub-postmasters should have been treated differently in being given more support.
In a way, you seem to be agreeing with what I'm saying, in that they should have received the same support that multiples maybe did get, and that Crown offices maybe did get.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have questions from Ms. Patrick and Mr. Steen.
Nothing for us, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Steen.
Mr. Ferlinc,
Yes.
I've got a few questions to ask of you. Can I ask, though, to go back to a document that Mr. Blake showed you, I think about 5 minutes ago? Frankly, if I give you the reference number, it's POL 33398. Mr. Ferlinc, I represent a large number of sub-postmasters and mistresses, and I'm instructed by a firm of solicitors called Howe & Co. So we should have on the screen, if I've...
That's not the one. 2398. You do. It was.
I believe I had the number right. POL 000-33398.
No, it's a different number, Mr. Steen, on the screen, on my screen anyway.
Sir, I agree. I think we are just tracking down the right one.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, we have it. Thank you very much. So this is a document. We can see, Mr. Ferlinc, sorry. We have your name there.
Mm-hmm.
The date is February 2011. Assurance Review, Quality of Auditing. Now, if we can just go, please, through to page 4 of that document, to start off with. Just helping us with the presentation of this. These appear to be in slide format. Is this a presentation or a draft for a presentation?
It's the way that reports, it was just the theme at the time. A lot of reports were written in a PowerPoint fashion. Partly, it's a reporting mechanism, but also it enables it to be presented.
Okay. We look at that page, which is page 4, and we go to the middle of the page. It says, the key findings from this review that require further review or attention relate to the following issues. So if we centre ourselves on the date, this is 2011. You've spoken to Mr. Blake more generally about the process of audit and the difficulties that you've discussed with him. Mm-hmm. So let's just have a look at some of the details that are being expressed here. Branches selected randomly for audits are not done on the basis of random sampling methods. So if we unpick that, it doesn't sound as though there are random audits. Is that right?
Okay, so up until 2008, 2009 maybe, there was a method for truly selecting random branches for audit. I believe that this is saying that after that, they weren't strictly random. There was some bias to the sample of random. So it might be that they chose random, but because they didn't have a resource in a particular area, they excluded that area from random sampling.
Right, because if you don't have random sampling, then as you're aware from having worked in audit for years, then biases can creep in. Absolutely,
and that was the message I wanted to put across. Up until 2008, 2009, I was satisfied that there were true random sampling methods applied. After that time, there wasn't.
But if it wasn't random, then who is doing the selection of the places of the post offices that should be targeted for auditing? Who's doing that?
Well, it would be the selection team within the audit team, or whatever that team was called at the time, but they weren't applying true random sampling methods. They were adding a bias to that method. So they were choosing 5%, but they were skewing the sample by excluding certain areas from the population.
So just help us a little bit more with this. When you say excluding certain areas of the population, what are we talking about? Are we saying that they chose, I don't know, one particular town over another, or they chose...
I can't remember the detail. All I can remember is that the sampling methods were flawed.
You'll forgive me for saying this doesn't sound like it's a good idea. If you're introducing something which is skewering effectively the results, because...
I'm agreeing with you. My finding is this was a negative aspect that needed to be addressed.
Okay. Well, let's see if it gets better or worse.
Okay.
Bullet point 2, team members seem to lack awareness of how the branch profile works and therefore why they are auditing a branch. Well, this seems to be a bad thing on its own, but in combination with non-random sampling, it seems to be make it worse. Do you agree?
I agree. This is my report, and I highlighted these issues.
Well, how is it that you've got members of the team that seem to lack awareness of how the branch profile works and why they are even there?
Right, can I just take a step back? This is my review of a team that I was not managing. I was reviewing an auditing activity. This was not my team. This was the team underneath the network that was performing training and auditing activities. And I was reviewing the quality of that activity. These are negative views that we probably share because these are negative findings from the review.
But as against the positive findings on the same page, the negatives do appear to be rather more, how can I put it, negative. They don't seem to be balanced by the positive findings.
There were more negatives than positives.
Whose failure is this? Is it yours because you're not maintaining oversight as the managerial level, or is it the team's? Who's the failure?
It's the team leader of the network audit support team.
Who was?
I beg your pardon?
Who was? What's the name of this team leader?
I don't know the name of the team leader.
Now, earlier in your evidence, you were discussing with Mr. Blake another document that you had dealt with. I'll just put this up on the screen for the moment, just so we identify what it is. Frankie, it's POL 000 88867. Right. And you recall this document, you were asked a number of questions about it.
Mm-hmm.
The matters that I just want to draw to your attention, just as a reminder, this version is dated, it seems, 7th of September 2003. You'll see that, the fourth entry down, thank you. And that author is you, Martin Ferlinc, National Audit Inspections Manager, and its owner is described as Tony Marsh. Now, just help us understand the connection between the author here and the owner. You write the thing, yes? What does the owner mean? What does that mean in terms of the post office?
He owns the policy, he authorises the policy, he gives oversight to the policy.
Right. Does that mean that in terms of your drafting of this, it then goes to Mr. Marsh, and Mr. Marsh then approves it for further work or use within the organisation?
Yeah,
how does that bit work?
Yeah, there's normally an assurance process on this first table. It seems to be missing from this particular document, but there's normally an author, an assurance process, and an owner. So normally an assurance process would look at it and critique it and give feedback, and the owner would sign it off.
Right. So somewhere, assuming this went further, this particular policy would go to Mr. Marsh, the head of security, yes, and he would then sign it off, and then that becomes the embedded document within the organisation. Is that right?
Yeah.
And can we just understand one other thing, which is the relationship between you as the National Audit and Inspections Manager and Tony Marsh, head of security. Does that mean that the audit and inspections part of POL at this time were under the control auspices of head of security or security?
Yes.
So security department, it's not just checking to make sure the windows are closed and that the firearms are on and things like that. This is the type of security that relates to the functioning, the proper functioning of the system. Is that correct?
Not of the system. Tony Marsh was the head of security, investigations and audit. So the personnel that reviewed security policies in branches, investigation policies, and now the audit and procedural inspection and policies.
And when you say investigations means the investigations into the possible offences that may be committed by sub-postmasters?
Yep.
So it's bringing together audit, which is reviewing the quality of the operational systems and giving an oversight of that and a result in relation to that, as well as investigating.
Those three teams, audit, security, physical security, and then investigations, which may have been called internal crime or external crime, they all were separate entities under Tony's ownership.
And who had brought them together under Tony's ownership?
From my recollection, because I used to report to Alan Barry, the Operations Directorate, there was a decision made that security investigations, I think, has always been together. from when I joined the post office, I think those two teams were always together. And the idea from Alan Barry was that there was a natural synergy for audit to be under Tony's command. And that would have been around about 2000, 2001 perhaps.
Okay. So we can take from your evidence that the contents of this document, which you described in your evidence today, looking at it with Mr. Blake, parts of it were unfair. We can take that this document was something that was known about to Mr. Marsh, Head of Security.
Yeah, just to clarify, I feel it's unfair now. Whether I felt it was unfair at the time is a different situation, because I don't think at that time I believed that there were systematic problems at branches involving Horizon. Now, clearly, it does appear unfair.
Well, let's take that on then. Let's go back to the time when you're writing this in 2003. We can look at the parts of it, but you appear to be in agreement that this is saying that a sub-postmaster who's experienced a loss that they've got no explanation for, there's no other explanation for it, you've got nothing to say that it's system fault, then tough, their problem, they've got to pay. Yeah? Does that sound like it seems fair to you at the time in September 2003?
At the time it must have done, but it doesn't seem fair now.
You owned a shop, Mr. Ferlinc, and someone came to you and said, well, look, mate, the situation is this, that there's some money gone missing here. Can't say it's your fault, but you've got to pay up. Does that sound like that's fair to you now?
It depends on how it's gone missing.
Well, you don't know. This is what's being said in this document. It doesn't matter how it got missing. It's not being proven to be the fault of the sub-postmaster.
But equally, then, there are other things that could have happened. It could have been an error. If you look at the amount of transaction corrections, the number of error notices, there are so many errors that were being made and are probably still being made. There could be members of staff employed by the sub-postmaster who may be taking money from them. There could be procedural security faults. So someone might just put their hand around the till and swipe some money. There's so many potential losses that could have occurred.
Yes, but I'm not even too sure you've actually mentioned any of those being at the fault of the sub-postmaster. But yet your document is saying they've got to pay up.
But contractually they're liable for losses through negligence and carelessness and error.
Right. And you think that only sounds unfair now, Mr. Ferlinc?
No, I'm saying if they are negligent, if they are carelessness, if they've made an error, then it's appropriate that they would be liable for the losses. I think what I'm saying now is that any errors relating to system issues would not have been fair.
Right. Help us a little bit more with this. I'm going to take you to another document in a moment, but let's help us a bit more with this. This suggestion, which is that you're saying has got something to do with the contractual requirements, or you're saying this was the way it always was that something that you had been told about, that you had been told by a manager about, by somebody else, saying, look, Mr. Ferlinc, this is the way it works? Is that something you were told?
When I joined the post office, when I joined the audit team, the contract very clearly stated that liability.
Right. Now, just reminding ourselves that the date of this document is 7th of September 2003, I'm going to take you to a different document, which is a Fujitsu document. Frankly, it's FUJ 000 98169. Okay. Now, this is, as you can see, this is the front page of this document, Fujitsu Services Input to Feasibility Study. Now, this essentially is at the starting point of the impact study, which is the impact program.
Okay.
And if we can go then to page 6 of this document, page 6 on relativity pagination, please, Frankie. And then I'm going to be referring to the 4th and 5th paragraphs on that page. So the one that starts, Fujitsu Services is pleased to submit this document. So, for clarity, Mr. Ferlinc, I'm not expecting you to have seen this document or indeed have been aware of it at the time. I just want to concentrate on the fact that this is a 2003 document. This is earlier to your document, and I want to see what's coming together in relation to this. Now, this is saying this. Fujitsu Services is pleased to submit this document, developed as an input to the Post Office E2E feasibility study. That's end-to-end feasibility study, and looks forward to continued joint working in the development of effective systems to support the post office business. All pricing and timescales assume this approach. This paper sets out Fujitsu Services' approach to the system's re-architecture, explains the design aims, and outlines then indicative pricing and offers a proposed implementation plan. So that in summary is what this thing is about.
Okay.
And then page 34, please, Frankie. So the paragraph I'm identifying here is 3.2.4, Project 4, Branch Liability Management. Within the accounting, reconciliation and settlement, including debt recovery and branch control area of the business, the following key business priorities have been identified. Simplify identification of debt, reduce the amount of reconciliation, increase the amount of debt recovered, and then the fourth bullet point, put the emphasis on clients and customers to validate the data. Okay. Now, do you agree that in the context of what we're talking about here, the clients and customers to validate the data, we're talking about the sub-postmasters, mistresses, the branches?
Well, clients would be people like DVLA. Clients would be the people that we're managing products for.
Sub-postmasters?
I think I'm not quite sure how I would say clients is DVLA, NS&I.
Well, we can read on. Simplify branch processes by reducing the amount of paper, centralise consolidated agents' debt, enabling matching of cash at branches with settlement with client.
Client is DVLA, Alliance and Leicester. That's what a client is.
Right. So you don't believe that this applies to the branch offices?
There might be aspects of it that do, but those things you pointed out don't.
I see. Now, we understand that the position in relation to the impact system at the time was that there was a need at the time, 2003, for the post office to make more money. It was essentially having financial difficulties. Is that something you're aware of?
Well, I mentioned throughout my presence today that there was a theme of reducing costs. Making more money is just the other side of that coin.
Right. And where this is enabling matching of cash at branches with settlement with client, what does that refer to then? What are the branches referred to?
Can you just point out which bullet point you're referring to?
That's, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7th bullet point down.
I'm not sure how that links a matching cash with settlement with client. I have no idea.
You don't think this might relate to sub-postmasters?
It's talking about settlement with client, so
Yeah.
I don't understand how it links with a matching of cash.
Well, what are these branches being spoken about here then?
I didn't write the document. I don't know what it means. It doesn't make any sense to me.
I see. Well, let's just go with put the emphasis on clients and customers to validate the data. Is that something you're familiar with, that in relation to the operation of the Horizon system, that the whoever is operating the system, they've got to validate the data?
No.
Why doesn't that make any sense to you?
Because product and branch accounting will be matching the data. They'll be matching the data that they get from branches through Horizon with the data that's provided from the clients.
Right. But then this document from Fujitsu is seeking to suggest that clients and customers, they've got to validate the data. What does that mean to you?
It doesn't mean anything to me, and maybe Fujitsu haven't understood the terminology. that the post office would use.
I see. Well, let's try it another way around. How would a sub-postmaster, going back to our earlier discussion in relation to losses, how would they be able to find the evidence that relates to the operation of the Horizon system? What access did they have?
The same access that an auditor would have in terms of access.
Same access as who?
The same access as an auditor would have, such as all the transaction reports that come out of Horizon, so transaction logs, summaries that they'll get out of the system.
So you think that the branch managers in the individual branches had the same access as the audit team?
That was my understanding at the time, and it is my understanding now, that the branch manager has the same access level as the auditor. Now, that might be a false memory, but that is my memory.
This question of what they had access to, the branches, is quite important. Do you not agree? That if they,
I agree.
Yeah. I'm just trying to understand what the audit process was then. Did you not make sure that the branch managers and mistresses had access to the same material, or is it just something you're thinking, well, that probably happened or it should have happened? Which?
No, they would have had the same access. I think what I'm not sure about is whether auditors had additional access to additional reports.
Right. There seems to be, if you draw back from your evidence, there seems to be a few things that are quite problematic. You're talking about a contractual obligation on sub-postmasters and mistresses to make good losses, yes?
Mm-hmm.
That's your first. Is that an assumption you made, or that was what you were told?
It's what I read in the contract manual.
You read
So
that in the contract manual?
In the sub-postmaster's contract, I seem to remember section 12 to 15 had details about the liability that sub-postmasters had for losses through negligence, carelessness, error.
Right. But what about trying to prove a loss when it's the system that's come up with it?
I agree. If the system's created the loss, it's very difficult for either party to be able to prove it.
Yeah. And if the pressure on the sub-postmaster and mistress is that they've got to, as this document appears to be saying, they've got to validate the data, they've got to actually show, where the problem is. If it's a system error, then how are they meant to do that?
As I said, I agree with you. If there's a system error, it wouldn't be easy for either party to be able to say this is an error that's been caused by the system.
Well, Mr. Ferlinc, when did it come to you that this was a bit of a problem? Did this only come to you before giving evidence, that you thought, well, bit of a pity these sub-postmasters mistresses weren't aware of what was going on with the Horizon system, and that we just nailed them for the money anyway?
No, I think what I said before is that these system errors weren't visible. They weren't things that I was aware of at the time.
When were you aware of system?
Probably when I left the business and in the media reports following, the mid-2010s.
But you're aware of some errors with the system. You've not
Yeah.
said it was perfect.
No, it wasn't perfect, and no system is perfect. As I said, every software system will have bugs and quirks, and they're fixed.
So who told you day to day, week to week of the errors? What reports did you get?
I didn't get any reports.
Did you investigate? Did you, as an example, in whatever way you could, give Fujitsu a ring or ask to visit them and consider with them how they deal with...
No.
You don't feel that that's something of a failure?
I think
Your
with
part.
hindsight, there were many things that could have been done differently. Absolutely.
In hindsight, this was a failure at the time, Mr. Ferlinc, a failure by you and your department to actually not grasp the nettle and not actually look at what problems lurk behind the scenes. Do you not agree?
No, I don't agree, because at the time my team's responsibility was for validating assets at branches, and that's what the team delivered.
You don't feel it was your responsibility just to keep your eyes closed, Mr. Ferlinc, and just sort of barrel on regardless?
Not at all. I didn't feel that that's what I was doing.
Right. Excuse me one moment. Thanks, sir.
All right. Is that all the questioning, Mr. Blake?
It is, yes.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ferlinc, for coming to give evidence, for answering a great many questions, and for answering them, so far as I'm concerned, at least with clarity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're back at 10:15 tomorrow morning with Mr. Marsh.
Very good. See you all at 10:15.